There is a skeleton in a museum in Khartoum. It belongs to a person who lived roughly 13,400 years ago in the Nile Valley in what is now northern Sudan. There is a stone point embedded in the left side of the rib cage, not resting near the bones, embedded, driven into the living tissue with enough force to lodge in bone. And here is the thing that should keep you up tonight. That person survived. The wound healed. The bone grew around the stone, which means that at some point after that first injury, somebody found this person and did it again. Because there is a second wound, unhealed, and that one killed them. Somebody was attacked, survived, recovered, went back to their life, and then was attacked again by someone else, or possibly the same people, and this time they did not get back up. That skeleton is 13,400 years old. There was no country, no border, no flag, no army, no general, no declaration. Just two groups of humans who decided, for reasons we will never fully know, that the other group needed to die, and we have been doing it ever since. So, did humans invent war? Or has war always been part of who we are? That question has haunted philosophers, anthropologists, archaeologists, and military historians for centuries. And the answer, it turns out, depends entirely on what you mean by the word war. Because if you mean organized armies with uniforms and supply chains and strategic objectives, that has a start date. We can point to it, but if you mean coordinated group violence, one band of humans deliberately killing another band of humans, the trail goes back so far that it starts to blur into the question of what it means to be human in the first place. Let's start with the bones, because the bones do not lie. That skeleton in Khartoum came from a place called Jebel Sahaba, also known as Cemetery 117. It was excavated in 1964 by archaeologist Fred Wendorf during construction work related to the Aswan Dam. What Wendorf found was a burial ground containing 61 sets of human remains dating to roughly 13,400 years ago, associated with a culture archaeologists call the Akkad. And these were not peaceful burials. Dozens of the skeletons showed evidence of violent death. Stone projectile points, the kind used on arrows and spears, were found embedded in bones or lying within the body cavities of the dead. For decades, Jebel Sahaba was cited as the oldest evidence of warfare. A prehistoric battle, a massacre, the first war. But in 2021, a paleoanthropologist named Isabelle Crevecoeur at the University of Bordeaux re-examined every single skeleton using modern microscopic analysis, and her findings, published in scientific reports, changed the story. Crevecoeur's team identified over 100 previously undocumented lesions on the remains. But the critical detail was this. Many individuals had both healed and unhealed wounds. The same person had been attacked, survived, and then been attacked again, sometimes multiple times over the course of their life. Men, women, and children, all of them. This was not one battle. This was chronic, recurring, low-level group violence, raids and skirmishes and retaliatory attacks, stretching across years or possibly generations. Crevecoeur's team concluded that the violence was likely driven by climate change. The Nile Valley at the end of the last ice age was experiencing severe environmental stress. Water levels fluctuated wildly. Resources became unpredictable. And when resources become unpredictable, humans become dangerous. Think about what that means. 13,400 years ago, no agriculture, no cities, no states, no written law, just small bands of hunter-gatherers living along a river, slowly being squeezed by a changing climate. And their response was organized, repeated, lethal violence against other groups of humans. Not a single outburst of rage, a pattern, a strategy, a way of life. Now, Jebel Sahaba is not alone. In 2012, a field assistant named Pedro Ebeya was walking near Lake Turkana in northern Kenya when he noticed bones eroding out of the sediment. What followed was one of the most significant archaeological excavations of the 21st century. A team led by Marta Mirazon-Lar of Cambridge University uncovered the remains of 27 individuals, dating to roughly 10,000 years ago. They published their findings in Nature in 2016. The bodies had not been buried. They had been left where they fell, in what was then a marshy lagoon at the edge of the lake. 10 of the skeletons showed clear, unambiguous signs of violent death: smashed skulls, broken knees, an obsidian blade still lodged in the skull of one man, arrow lesions in the necks of others. One woman was found in a position that suggested her hands had been bound. The site is called Nataruk. And here is why Nataruk matters more than almost any other site in this story. These were not farmers. They were not settled people defending a granary or a wall. They were nomadic hunter-gatherers. The traditional explanation for the invention of war has always been that war arose with agriculture. You plant crops, you store food, you build a village, and now you have something worth stealing. You have property. You have borders. You have the motive for organized violence. That was the theory. Nataruk blew a hole in it. Because these people had none of that. They were mobile. They owned what they could carry. And someone killed them anyway. Why? We do not know. Maybe it was about territory. The area around Lake Turkana 10,000 years ago was lush and resource-rich. Maybe it was about women or children. The demographics of the dead at Nataruk include adults of both sexes, but no young adult females, which some researchers have interpreted as evidence that women may have been taken as captives. Or maybe it was about something we cannot reconstruct from bones alone: revenge, a feud, an insult that escalated across generations until someone decided to end it permanently. But before we go further into the human record, we need to talk about chimpanzees. Because the question of whether humans invented war or inherited it has a test case, and it lives in the forests of East Africa. In 1974, primatologist Jane Goodall was observing chimpanzees at Gombe Stream National Park in Tanzania. She had been studying this group for over a decade. She knew them individually, she had named them, and then the community split. A group of males who had been spending more time in the southern part of the territory broke away and formed their own community. The northern group was called Kasakela. The southern splinter group was called Kahama. And what happened next changed primatology forever. Over the next 4 years, from 1974 to 1978, the Kasakela males systematically hunted down and killed every single adult male of the Kahama community. They did not do this in a single attack. They did it in coordinated raids. Small groups of Kasakela males would travel silently into Kahama territory, find an isolated individual, surround him, and beat him to death, one by one. Over 4 years, they killed all 6 adult males. They killed at least one adolescent male. Several females disappeared and were presumed dead. By 1978, the Kahama community had ceased to exist. The Kasakela males expanded into their territory. Goodall was devastated. She later wrote that for years afterward, she would wake in the night with horrific images in her mind. She had spent a decade demonstrating that chimpanzees were intelligent, social, emotionally complex beings, and now she had watched them commit what could only be described as war. Think about what the Gombe War means for the question of how humans invented war. Chimpanzees are our closest living relatives. We share roughly 98.7% of our DNA with them. We last shared a common ancestor roughly 6 to 7 million years ago. If chimpanzees engage in coordinated, lethal, territorial violence, and they clearly do, then the capacity for that behavior may predate the human lineage entirely. We may not have invented war. We may have inherited it. But not everyone agrees with that conclusion. This is where the debate gets heated, and it has been heated for decades. On one side, you have what scholars call the deep roots theory, the idea that war is an evolved behavior, hardwired into our biology by millions of years of natural selection. The key modern proponent of this view is Lawrence Keeley, an archaeologist at the University of Illinois at Chicago, who published a book in 1996 called War Before Civilization: The Myth of the Peaceful Savage. Keeley compiled archaeological and ethnographic data from dozens of societies and argued that prehistoric warfare was not rare or ritualized. It was constant, brutal, and far more lethal per capita than anything in the modern world. His data suggested that in many pre-state societies, between 15 and 25% of males died violently at the hands of other humans. 15 to 25%. Compare that to the roughly 1 to 2% of Europeans who died from war in the 20th century, including both world wars. Steven Pinker picked up Keeley's data in his 2011 book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, and built an entire argument around it, that humans are actually becoming less violent over time, not more, and that the modern state, for all its flaws, has been a remarkably effective pacifying force. On the other side, you have R. Brian Ferguson, an anthropologist at Rutgers University, and Douglas Fry, who published a study in Science in 2013 with Patrick Soderberg. Ferguson has spent his career arguing that war is not biological. It is cultural. It is an invention, a technology, if you want to think of it that way, that humans developed under specific conditions, and that those conditions did not exist for most of our evolutionary history. Ferguson argues that Keeley and Pinker cherry-pick their data. He points out that many of the societies Keeley cites as warlike were already in contact with colonial powers, and that colonial encroachment itself often sparked or intensified violence. He also distinguishes between individual homicide and war. A murder is not a war. A feud between two families is not a war. War, Ferguson argues, requires social organization, group identity, strategic planning, and the dehumanization of the enemy. And those things, he says, are learned, not born. Fry and Soderberg's 2013 study examined 148 instances of lethal aggression in 21 mobile forager band societies, the kind of small, nomadic groups that most closely resemble how humans lived for the vast majority of our existence. Their finding? Most lethal violence in these groups was personal, individual disputes, jealousy, revenge, domestic conflicts, acts that would be classified as homicide, not warfare. Organized group attacks on other groups were a minority of the killing. Their conclusion: war is not the default state of humanity. It is a specific cultural behavior that emerged under specific historical pressures. So who is right? Honestly, probably both of them, and neither of them, because the evidence points to something more complicated than either side wants to admit. The capacity for group violence appears to be very old. Chimpanzees have it. The bones at Jebel Sahaba and Nataruk have it. Something in the primate brain, some combination of territorial instinct, coalition behavior, and the ability to categorize others as not us, appears to predate agriculture, cities, and civilization by tens of thousands of years, possibly millions. But the capacity for violence is not the same as war. Your neighbor has the capacity to punch you in the face. That does not mean your neighborhood is at war. War requires something beyond the capacity for violence. It requires organization, logistics, leadership, a reason to fight that is shared by a group, not just felt by an individual. And those things, the infrastructure of war, do appear to have been invented, built, developed over time, in response to specific conditions. And the single most important of those conditions was this: having something worth fighting over that could not be moved. For most of human history, we were nomadic. If a neighboring group became aggressive, you could leave, walk away, find a different valley, a different hunting ground. Conflict was possible, clearly. Nataruk proves that. But it was not inevitable, because the thing that makes war self-sustaining, the thing that turns a raid into a campaign, is the inability to retreat. And the inability to retreat arrived with agriculture. Roughly 12,000 years ago, in what archaeologists call the Neolithic Revolution, humans in several parts of the world began domesticating plants and animals. They settled down, they built permanent villages, they stored surplus food, and the moment they did that, they created something that had never existed before in human history: immovable wealth. A granary full of wheat cannot run away. A herd of domesticated cattle cannot be picked up and carried to the next valley. A field that took months to clear and plant cannot be abandoned without devastating cost. For the first time, humans had possessions that were worth defending and worth stealing, and the archaeological record reflects this. Fortified settlements begin appearing within a few thousand years of the earliest agriculture. The walls of Jericho, dating to roughly 8000 BC, were long cited as the first military fortifications, though modern scholars like Ofer Bar Yosef have argued they may have been built for flood control rather than defense. But by 6000 BC, unmistakable defensive architecture starts showing up across the Near East and into Europe. Ditches, palisades, watchtowers. You do not build a watchtower because you are worried about floods. And here is something interesting about one of the earliest large settlements we know of. Çatalhöyük in modern Turkey existed from roughly 7500 to 5700 BC. It had no walls, no gates, no defensive perimeter of any kind. What it had instead was architecture that was itself a defense. Houses were built directly against each other, sharing walls, with no streets or ground-level doors. You entered your home through a hole in the roof, using a ladder, which meant that the entire outer face of the settlement was a blank, windowless wall of mud brick. If you wanted to attack Çatalhöyük, you had to scale a featureless vertical surface while the people living behind it dropped things on your head. They did not build fortifications. They built their entire village as one. And the evidence from the site shows remarkably low levels of violent trauma in the skeletal remains. Whatever they were doing, it was working. But Çatalhöyük also tells us something else. The fact that a community of several thousand people designed their homes specifically to repel attackers tells you that attackers existed. You do not build a defensible settlement unless there is something to defend against. The architecture is the evidence. The walls of Jericho, whether they stopped floods or armies, and the rooftop entry design of Çatalhöyük, whether it was deliberate or accidental, both point to the same conclusion. By 8000 BC, organized violence between groups of humans was common enough that people were literally building their lives around the expectation of it. And then something happened that turned raiding into war. Hierarchy. The rise of chiefs, kings, and centralized power structures that could command resources, conscript labor, and direct violence on a scale that no band of hunter-gatherers could match. In Mesopotamia, by roughly 3000 BC, the first true city-states, Uruk, Lagash, Umma, were competing for control of the fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And they were competing with organized armies. The stele of the vultures, carved around 2450 BC, discovered by French archaeologist Ernest de Sarzeck at the site of ancient Girsu in modern Iraq, depicts King Eannatum of Lagash leading his soldiers against the rival city of Umma. And those soldiers are not a disorganized mob. They are marching in formation, shoulder to shoulder, shields interlocked, spears leveled, helmets on. This is the earliest known depiction of the phalanx, a tactical formation that would dominate warfare for the next 2,000 years. The stele also shows vultures carrying away severed heads and limbs. It is a war monument, the first one we know of, and it tells us that by 2450 BC, war was not just a thing that happened. It was a thing that was celebrated, commemorated, carved into stone for future generations to admire. Now, those Sumerian city-states fought each other with citizen militias. Farmers and laborers called up for seasonal campaigns, fighting for a few weeks, then going home to tend their fields. That works when your enemy is the city next door, but it does not work when you want to build an empire. And roughly 200 years after Eannatum, someone figured that out, Sargon of Akkad. Around 2334 BC, a man whose origins are still debated, possibly a cupbearer to the king of Kish, seized power and began conquering everything within reach. And his key innovation was not a new weapon or a new tactic. It was a new kind of army. Sargon is credited with creating the first permanent, professional standing army in history. Soldiers who did not go home after the battle. Soldiers who trained year-round, who were fed and paid by the state, whose entire purpose was fighting. Ancient texts claim he maintained a force of 5,400 soldiers, who ate bread daily before him. A professional army means you can campaign in any season. You can project force across vast distances. You can hold conquered territory with permanent garrisons. Sargon used this army to forge the Akkadian Empire, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. It was the first empire in history, and it was built on the back of the first army that existed not to defend a city, but to conquer one. That is the moment where war stops being a defensive reaction and becomes a tool of policy. A thing you do not because you have to, but because you can. Because you have the infrastructure, the logistics, and the permanent military force to make it happen whenever you decide it should happen. That is a transition as important as the invention of agriculture itself, because agriculture created something worth fighting over. But standing armies created the ability to fight over anything, anywhere, at any time. The standard of dating to roughly 2600 BC, goes even further. One side, labeled war by modern scholars, shows battle carts pulled by onagers trampling enemies, infantry in formation, prisoners being led before the king. The other side, peace, shows a banquet with musicians. War and peace, already understood as two sides of the same political coin, 4,600 years ago. And then, roughly 1,000 years later, the first battle we can actually reconstruct in detail. In 1457 BC, Egyptian pharaoh Thutmose III marched his army through a narrow mountain pass called the Aruna, against the advice of his own generals, to surprise a coalition of Canaanite forces camped outside the fortress city of Megiddo. His military scribe, Tianeni, recorded the entire campaign on the walls of the Temple of Amun-Re at Karnak. Troop movements, supply logistics, the pharaoh's tactical decisions. The Battle of Megiddo is the first battle in recorded history with a detailed, reliable account. It is the moment where war stops being something we infer from bones and stone monuments and becomes something we can read about in the words of the people who fought it. But between the first raids and the first recorded battles, something changed that deserves attention. The weapons changed. And the way they changed tells you something about how war went from being an occasional disaster to a permanent institution. For hundreds of thousands of years, human weapons were tools repurposed for violence. A spear is a hunting tool. A bow is a hunting tool. An axe is a forestry tool. They can all kill a person, obviously, but they were not designed for that purpose. And there is something psychologically significant about that distinction. When you kill someone with a hunting spear, you are misusing a survival tool. When you kill someone with a weapon designed for that specific purpose, something has shifted. You have made an object whose only reason for existing is the death of another human being. That is not survival. That is preparation. The first object that was designed specifically and exclusively to kill another human being, as far as archaeologists can determine, was the mace. A heavy stone head, shaped and polished, attached to a wooden handle. You cannot cut meat with a mace. You cannot harvest grain with one. You cannot use it to skin an animal, or dig a hole, or build a shelter. A mace does exactly one thing. It delivers concentrated blunt force to a human skull. That is what it was designed for. That is all it does. Mace heads begin appearing in the archaeological record of the Near East roughly 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, right around the time that settled communities with stored resources and fixed boundaries started needing to defend themselves against other humans. And you can trace the psychology of war in what happened to the mace afterward. It stopped being just a weapon. It became a symbol. By the time of the Egyptian pharaohs, the mace had become the icon of royal power itself. The Narmer palette, dating to approximately 3100 BC, shows King Narmer raising a pear-shaped mace over the head of a kneeling prisoner. The first king we can name by title on a unified Egyptian artifact, and the image he chose to represent his authority was himself, about to crush a man's skull. The very icon of kingship was a weapon designed for killing. War was no longer something that happened to societies. It was how societies defined themselves. And that brings us to the one other piece of evidence we need to look at before we can answer the question. The rock art. In the cliffs and rock shelters of eastern Spain, there are paintings dating to the Mesolithic and early Neolithic periods, roughly 6,000 to 2,500 BC. The paintings are part of a tradition archaeologists call Levantine art, and they are some of the most vivid prehistoric images found anywhere in Europe. They depict animals, they depict hunting scenes, and some of them depict something else entirely. Groups of human figures, carrying bows, running toward other groups of human figures who are also carrying bows. Battle scenes. Not hunting, not ritual. Combat. People shooting arrows at other people. And the scenes are not abstract. They show specific formations. Archers in loose groups, converging from different directions. They show what appear to be organized attacks, and they are, as far as we know, the earliest visual depictions of war anywhere in the world. Meanwhile, on the other side of the planet, archaeological evidence tells its own story. At a site along the Tollens River in northern Germany, an amateur archaeologist named Ronald Borgwart discovered a human arm bone sticking out of the riverbank in 1996. There was a bronze arrowhead embedded in it. Systematic excavations began in 2007. What researchers found was the oldest battlefield in Europe. The remains of at least 150 individuals, along with thousands of bone fragments, bronze arrowheads, flint points, and wooden clubs, scattered along a 3-kilometer stretch of riverbank. The battle took place around 1250 BC, during the Bronze Age. Researchers estimate that roughly 4,000 warriors may have been involved. Up to 1,000 of them may have died. The skulls show blunt force trauma, consistent with the wooden clubs found at the site. The long bones show fractures from heavy blows. Bronze and flint arrowheads were lodged in ribs and spines, and isotopic analysis of the bones showed that some combatants came from hundreds of kilometers away, with dietary signatures, specifically traces of millet, suggesting origins in southern Central Europe. This was not a local dispute. This was an organized, interregional military conflict, fought by people who traveled long distances specifically to fight. Before Tollens, historians generally assumed that Bronze Age Northern Europe was a relatively peaceful trading zone. The battlefield rewrote that assumption entirely. These people were waging wars on a scale that historians did not think was possible for pre-state European societies. And then there is Crow Creek. In 1978, archaeologists excavating a site near the Missouri River in South Dakota uncovered a mass grave containing the remains of at least 486 people, men, women, and children. Nearly all of them showed signs of extreme violence: scalping, skull fractures, dismemberment. The bodies had been left exposed for a period before being dumped into the village's own fortification ditch. The massacre occurred around 1325 AD, likely driven by resource competition during a prolonged drought. This was not a battlefield where two armies met by arrangement. This was the total destruction of a community. Now, there is one more thing that needs to be said about how humans invented war, and it is the thing that nobody likes talking about. Because the archaeological evidence, the bones, the weapons, the fortifications, those tell you what happened. They do not tell you how it was possible. How do you get a group of human beings who are biologically wired for empathy, who feel pain when they see others in pain, who form deep social bonds with strangers? How do you get those people to systematically kill other human beings who are in every measurable way exactly like them? The answer is a psychological mechanism that every culture on Earth has independently developed. You make the other group not human. You give them a different name, a different category. You define your group by what the other group is not. And once someone is not part of your group, the normal rules of empathy and cooperation simply stop applying. Psychologists call this the in-group, out-group distinction, and it operates in every human society ever studied, from hunter-gatherer bands to modern nation-states. It takes almost nothing to trigger it. A different language, a different appearance, a different river valley, a different god. The mechanism is the same everywhere. Draw a line, decide who is on which side, and then the people on the other side of that line become something you can kill without it feeling like murder. That is not a recent invention. That is not a product of civilization. That is a feature of the human brain that appears to be very, very old. And without it, war as we know it would be impossible. Because the hardest part of war was never building a better weapon. The hardest part was convincing people to use it. So here is the answer to the question you came for. Humans did not invent war the way someone invents a tool, in one place, at one time, with one clear purpose. War emerged gradually, over thousands of years, as a series of escalations. The capacity for group violence appears to be ancient, possibly predating our species entirely. Chimpanzees demonstrate it. The bones at Jebel Sahaba, 13,400 years old, demonstrate it. Nataruk, 10,000 years old, demonstrates it with hunter-gatherers who had no farms, no cities, and no borders. But the capacity for violence is not war. War requires infrastructure. It requires organization, leadership, logistics, and a sustained motive. And those elements were assembled, piece by piece, over roughly the last 12,000 years. Agriculture created immovable wealth worth fighting over. Settled communities created borders worth defending. Hierarchy created leaders who could organize and direct violence on a large scale. And technology created weapons designed not for hunting animals, but for killing people. The probability that war is a single, discrete invention that emerged at one point in human history is essentially zero. The probability that the capacity for organized group violence has deep evolutionary roots, shared with our closest primate relatives, is very high, roughly 85 to 90%, based on the convergence of archaeological, primatological, and anthropological evidence. But whether that capacity becomes war depends on conditions, the right pressures, the right social structures, the right stakes. For most of human history, those conditions did not exist. And then, roughly 12,000 years ago, they did. And once they did, war proved to be one of the most persistent inventions our species has ever produced. The bones at Jebel Sahaba are 13,400 years old. The walls of Jericho are 10,000 years old. The first phalanx depicted on the stele of the vultures is 4,450 years old. The first recorded battle at Megiddo is 3,480 years old. And tonight, somewhere on Earth, a weapon system designed by engineers who were educated at universities, that were built with taxes, that were collected by governments, that were founded to protect borders, that were drawn by treaties that were signed to end wars, is being loaded, tested, and aimed. The technology has changed beyond anything a Neolithic farmer could have imagined. The reason has not. Somebody has something, somebody else wants it, and the distance between those two facts is still measured in the same unit it has always been measured in: bodies.